Every World Cup city this summer sits about where you'd expect, except one. Seattle is farther north than Toronto, farther north than Montreal, sitting right on the level of Zurich. But its location isn't even the strange part. Seattle is the only city in the tournament squeezed onto a strip of land barely 3 miles wide, pinched between an ocean and a lake, and its stadium sits on ground that used to be the bottom of the sea. So how did the city everyone pictures soaked in rain end up the one cool, dry exception in a tournament built around fighting the heat? The answer was decided around 15,000 years ago by a wall of ice. And it changes almost everything you think you know about this place. Here's the thing that breaks people's expectations before a single match kicks off. Most of this World Cup is a fight against dangerous heat. Across the host cities, players are bracing for brutal afternoons, hydration breaks, and matches scheduled around the worst of the sun. By most measures, the overwhelming majority of the tournament's venues cross into heat-stress territory during June and July. Seattle is the exception that runs backwards. While the rest of the map sweats, this one corner stays cool and dry, and the reason traces all the way back to that wall of ice. Start with where the city actually sits. Seattle rests at roughly 47.6 degrees north. To put that in perspective, that's farther north than Toronto, which sits near 43.7. It's farther north than Montreal at about 45.5. It lines up almost exactly with Zurich and Budapest, cities most people file mentally under Europe, not Pacific Northwest. On a globe, Seattle isn't grouped with the rest of the American host cities at all. It's physically displaced, sitting up at a latitude that belongs to a different continent's weather conversation. By that logic, it should be cold. Sitting that far north, you'd expect frigid, gray, miserable conditions. The kind of place where a summer tournament would be a gamble against the chill rather than the heat. But Seattle isn't frigid. It's mild. The Pacific Ocean sits right against it, and a vast body of water like that doesn't swing wildly between hot and cold the way open land does. It holds its temperature, and it hands that steadiness to the coastline beside it. So Seattle gets the northern latitude without the northern punishment. Which raises the obvious question, if it's that far north and still that mild, what about all that rain everyone talks about? This is the part that flips the whole reputation on its head. The rainy Seattle you're picturing, the one from every movie, every gray establishing shot, every joke about people who never see the sun, is real, but it's a misread of what the numbers actually say. Seattle's reputation is built on frequency, not volume. It rains often there, it drizzles, it spits, it stays overcast. But the total amount of water that falls in a year is surprisingly modest. Seattle actually gets less annual rainfall than New York City. It gets less than Atlanta. The city's fame for being soaked comes from how many days the sky stays gray, not from how much water comes down. And here's where the timing turns almost unfair. Seattle's summers aren't just drier than its winters, they're nearly bone dry. A typical July brings under an inch of rain, somewhere around 3/4 of an inch in a normal year. That's not Pacific Northwest weather as anyone imagines it. That's effectively Mediterranean, the kind of dry, sunlit stretch you'd associate with Southern Europe. The rain that defines Seattle's image shows up in the dark half of the year. The World Cup, by pure scheduling luck, lands directly inside the city's one reliably dry window. Now, to be fair, Seattle isn't the only venue catching a break from the heat. Vancouver, just up the coast, is essentially Seattle's Pacific Northwest twin and shares the same gentle summer. San Francisco has its famous fog, and Mexico City stays cool because it sits at high altitude. So Seattle isn't alone in being comfortable. What it is the standout against the tournament's dominant pattern, a competition where most venues are managing heat, and this one is managing a sweater in the evening. And what makes Seattle truly singular isn't the climate at all. It's what lies underneath it, because if you like geography that quietly rewrites what you thought you knew about a place, this channel runs on exactly that, so consider subscribing before we get to the part where the ground itself stops making sense. So why is a city this far north so dry in the middle of the year? The answer is written into the mountains on either side of it. Seattle sits in a basin guarded by two great walls of rock. To the west stand the Olympic Mountains. To the east rise the Cascade Range. Together, they act like a pair of shields. When storms roll in off the Pacific, they slam into the Olympics first and dump much of their moisture on the way up. When Arctic air tries to push down from the interior, the Cascades block it. The city in the middle gets the leftovers, moderated, filtered, and far gentler than the raw weather hitting the ranges on either side. That same marine air pressing in from the ocean keeps the temperature on a leash. It cools the hot days and warms the cold nights, smoothing everything toward mild. So the famous rain and the World Cup friendly dryness aren't two separate facts about Seattle. They're the same fact, seen in two seasons. The mountains and the ocean that wring out gray drizzle for much of the year are the exact same system that produces those clear, dry, comfortable summer weeks. But the mountains only explain the weather. The shape of the land itself, the basin Seattle is folded into, the deep cold water on its doorstep, came from somewhere more violent. Around 15,000 years ago, a massive lobe of ice called the Vashon Glacier ground its way down over this entire region. It carved the basin. It gouged out the troughs that would fill with water. When it finally retreated, it left behind the exact landscape the city would later squeeze itself into. The weather is the gift the ice gave Seattle. The land is the gift it took its time sculpting, and that land turns out to be barely there at all. Here's the detail that should stop you cold. Seattle is not a city sprawling comfortably across solid ground. At its narrowest, the city sits on a strip of land under 3 miles wide. On one side is saltwater, Puget Sound, a glacier-cut trough so deep it averages something like 450 feet down. On the other side is freshwater, Lake Washington, a long inland body running parallel to the Sound. Seattle is wedged between them on an isthmus, a thin waste of land with deep water pressing in from both directions. Most major cities have room to grow outward in every direction. Seattle has an ocean to its west and a lake to its east, and barely a sliver of dry ground in between. That geography didn't just shape where people built, it shaped how they had to move. Crossing Lake Washington has always been the problem, and Seattle solved it in a way nobody else on the planet has. The lake is too deep and too soft-bottomed for conventional bridge pilings in places, so the region floats its bridges instead, roadways resting on giant pontoons that sit directly on the water's surface. And just before the tournament in late March of 2026, the city opened something genuinely new. A light rail line running passengers across a floating bridge, reportedly the first time a train has carried riders over a floating bridge anywhere in the world. It runs on the Interstate 90 crossing, the Homer-Hadley Bridge, threading commuters straight over the lake the glacier left behind. It's worth keeping one thing straight here, because it's easy to blur. That light rail crossing is a different structure from the SR 520 Evergreen Point Bridge farther north, which holds its own claim as the longest floating bridge in the world. Two separate floating bridges, two separate records, both sitting on water deep enough that engineers decided floating was easier than reaching the bottom. Being cool and dry is only the first oddity about this place. The second is that the land it stands on is so thin, the city had to learn to drive and ride across open water just to function. Now for the loop the hook opened, the stadium on the bottom of the sea. Seattle Stadium, the tournament name for the venue locals know as Lumen Field, sits in a district called Sodo, just south of downtown. And the ground it stands on was never natural land at all. It was built on reclaimed tide flats, the muddy tidal edge of Elliott Bay that the city filled in over a century ago to manufacture flat, buildable ground where the sea used to wash in and out. When the hook said the stadium sits on ground that used to be the bottom of the sea, that wasn't a metaphor. The pitch is laid over filled-in seafloor, and Seattle didn't stop at filling in the water. In a city this pinched with this little flat land to spare, people went after the hills too. In the early 1900s, engineers carried out the Denny Regrade, an astonishing project that used high-pressure water cannons to blast entire slopes apart and sluice the loosened earth away, flattening the terrain north of downtown into something a growing city could actually use. It's worth being precise about this, because the two stories often get mashed together. The hill-blasting Denny Regrade happened north of downtown, while the stadium sits on tide flat fill closer to the water. Different projects, different parts of the city, but the same instinct running through both. When the land won't give you room, you reshape the land. The result is a stadium unlike any other in the tournament. It's the only cup venue where you can walk from the edge of the pitch to a working deepwater Pacific port in a matter of minutes. Container cranes loom over the same neighborhood as the goalposts. A city this squeezed didn't inherit the ground its biggest stadium stands on. It had to invent that ground, grain by grain, out of mud and water. There's a darker side to all this beautiful sculpted geography, and it runs directly beneath the field. The same deep tectonic machinery that carved Puget Sound and built the mountains never switched off. Off the coast, an entire slab of ocean crust is slowly grinding underneath the continent, the kind of subduction zone that builds the world's largest earthquakes. Closer in, a crack called the Seattle Fault runs right under the downtown area, passing near the very ground the city is packed with people and stadiums. This places the region among the higher seismic risk zones in North America, capable in the long term of a major quake. It's also worth remembering what the stadium is built on. That filled-in tide-flat, soft ground laid over old seafloor is exactly the kind of soil that shakes hardest when the earth moves, amplifying a tremor rather than absorbing it. None of this is a prediction about a match day or any specific moment. It's simply the geological reality of where Seattle was built. The forces that gave the city its deep harbor, its dramatic skyline of water and mountains, its cool and gentle climate, are the same forces that loaded the ground beneath it with stored energy. The gift and the risk come from one source. You don't get the beauty of this place without the fault that made it. Even the field the players run on had to be manufactured, which fits this city perfectly. No brand new stadiums were built for the 2026 tournament, and Seattle's venue had a problem. It normally plays on artificial turf, and the World Cup demands real grass. So crews didn't simply roll out sod a few days early. They engineered an entire living pitch, growing real grass on a layer of sand laid over the existing surface, prepared well in advance so it would be rooted and ready by kickoff. Reports point to a lead time measured in roughly a couple of years and an upgrade cost in the tens of millions, though those exact figures are worth confirming against a primary source before anyone states them on camera. It's a small thing next to glaciers and faults, but it rhymes with everything else about this place. A city built on filled-in seafloor, threaded with floating bridges, carved out of blasted hills, now grows its own field on top of plastic because nature didn't hand it one ready to play on. Seattle has spent its entire existence manufacturing what the land refused to provide. The grass is just the latest example. Here's what might be the most lasting consequence of all, and it has nothing to do with who lifts the trophy. For 6 weeks, global television will broadcast Seattle in its dry, sunlit, cool evening summer window, the version of the city almost nobody outside the region pictures. Hundreds of millions of people who think of Seattle as a rainy backwater will see something that looks nothing like the cliché. Clear skies, blue water on 3 sides, mountains on the horizon, comfortable air. Whether that's enough to permanently flip the city's image is an open question, and it's fair to leave it open. Reputations built over decades don't always crack in a single summer, but the geography that outlives the matches is already in place. The floating bridge light rail, the Cross Lake crossing finished just in time, the deepwater port beside the pitch. Those are the lasting legacy, long after the last whistle. The inversion this video is about doesn't just play locally for a few weeks, it plays worldwide to the largest audience the city has ever had in exactly the season that contradicts its own legend. So come back to where we started, the stadium on the bottom of the sea. That image isn't just a hook, it's the whole truth of the place. The sea is still there, pressing in on 3 sides. The fault is still there, waiting under the streets. The rain everyone pictures is still real for roughly 11 months of the year. It has simply stepped off stage for the 6 weeks the world happens to be watching. Seattle sits on a borrowed sliver of manufactured land, between an ocean and a lake, dry at exactly the wrong moment for everyone expecting it to be soaked. That's precisely why it looks like the one city this World Cup somehow got wrong. Every other host city spent this summer fighting the heat. Seattle just sat there, cool, dry, and quietly standing on the bottom of the sea. If you want to see how this same kind of hidden geography quietly built another place you thought you understood, watch one of the videos on screen right now and drop a comment with the city you want explained next.